The iron bar came down with crushing force. Robert Warnke never saw it coming. On June 20th, 1929, inside the laundry room of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, a man who called himself the Spirit of Meanness Personified finally made good on his promise. Karl Panzram had warned the prison warden upon his arrival, "I'll kill the first man that bothers me." Warnke, the laundry foreman known for bullying prisoners, had ignored multiple warnings. He pushed the wrong man one too many times. When guards found Warnke's body, his skull was completely shattered. Standing over the corpse was inmate number 31614, Karl Panzram, waiting calmly for what would come next. This wasn't Panzram's first kill. By his own count, it was his 21st. What made this murder different wasn't the brutality. Panzram had perfected that art form over decades. What made this different was that Karl Panzram wanted to die for it. When authorities offered him legal appeals, when activists tried to save his life, Panzram's response was chilling. "The only thanks you and your kind will ever get from me for your efforts on my behalf is that I wish you all had one neck and that I had my hands on it." Before we dive into one of America's most disturbing criminal minds, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. The story of Karl Panzram begins not with violence, but with a baby's cry on a Minnesota farm. June 28, 1891. Johann and Matilda Panzram, immigrants from East Prussia, welcomed their sixth child into the world. They named him Charles, though he would later prefer Karl. Looking at that newborn, no one could have imagined they were witnessing the birth of what would become one of America's most brutal serial killers. The Panzram farm near East Grand Forks was no place for childhood dreams. Johann and Matilda ran their household like a prison camp. 7 children worked the fields from dawn until dark, and when truancy laws forced them into school during the day, their parents made them work the fields all night. Karl later remembered getting only 2 hours of sleep before school. Punishments for any perceived failure included being chained up or starved for days. By age 5, Karl already saw himself as different. He would later write that other children didn't like him, and he didn't like them either. He became a liar and a thief before he could properly tie his shoes. But the real turning point came when Karl was 7 years old. His father abandoned the family without warning, leaving Matilda to raise 7 children alone on a failing farm. Around this same time, Karl developed a serious infection in his skull that required surgery. The operation was performed at home, making the infection worse. When they finally took him to a hospital for proper medical care, the damage may have already been done. Doctors could never determine if the infection and botched surgery caused brain damage, but the timing was unmistakable. After the surgery, Karl's behavior became increasingly violent and uncontrollable. One by one, his older brothers left the farm. The family was falling apart. In 1905, his stepbrother Louis drowned while working as a lumberjack. Karl was now essentially alone with a mother who saw him as nothing but a burden and a source of free labor. The first signs of Karl's future appeared when he was just 8 years old. In 1899, he was arrested for being drunk and disorderly, at 8 years old. 4 years later, at 12, he was arrested again for being drunk and incorrigible. That same year, he committed his first major theft, stealing cake apples and a revolver from a neighbor's house. In October 1903, Matilda Panzram made a decision that would change her son forever. She sent 12-year-old Karl to the Minnesota State Training School, supposedly a reform school for troubled boys. What happened to Karl in that institution would destroy whatever humanity might have remained in him. The Minnesota State Training School was a house of horrors disguised as rehabilitation. Karl later wrote that staff members regularly beat, tortured, and raped the children in a room they nicknamed the paint shop, because boys left that room painted with their own blood and bruises. The abuse was systematic, brutal, and constant. Karl's formal criminal education began in earnest in 1906, when he was arrested for burglary in Butte, Montana. He was sentenced to 1 year at Montana State Reform School in Miles City. If the Minnesota Training School had been bad, Montana was worse. The guards were more violent, the conditions more brutal, and the lesson Karl learned was simple: the strong prey on the weak, and he intended to be strong. When a guard named Bouchard punished Karl for some minor infraction, Karl's response was swift and devastating. He grabbed a wooden board and beat the guard so severely that the man was critically injured. For this, Karl was thrown into solitary confinement, but he didn't care. He had proven to himself that he could hurt others worse than they could hurt him. In 1907, Karl and another inmate named James Benson escaped from Montana State Reform School. What followed was a weeks-long crime spree across Montana that included robbery, burglary, and arson. Karl had a particular hatred for churches. He burned down several during this spree. When asked later why he targeted churches, Karl said he hated everything that claimed to represent goodness or hope. After separating from Benson, Karl made a decision that would give him access to weapons and training that would make him even more dangerous. While drunk in a Helena saloon, he enlisted in the United States Army. The military assigned him to the 6th Infantry at Fort William Henry Harrison, but Karl was a hopeless soldier. He refused to follow orders, stole supplies, and generally made life miserable for everyone around him. The Army court-martialed Karl for stealing $88.24 worth of supplies, a significant sum in 1907. His sentence was served at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, from April 1908 to August 1910. Karl would later write that if he had been a rotten egg before Leavenworth, the military prison destroyed any remaining shred of goodness in him. The guards at Leavenworth were brutal even by the standards of early 20th century military justice. Karl was beaten, starved, and subjected to punishments that would be considered torture today. But instead of breaking him, these experiences taught Karl new levels of cruelty. He studied the guards' methods, learned their techniques, and promised himself that someday he would use their own methods against innocent people. When Karl was finally released and dishonorably discharged in August 1910, he had been transformed from a violent teenager into something approaching a human weapon. He was 20 years old, had spent most of his life in institutions, and had learned that violence was not only acceptable, it was the most effective way to get what he wanted. After his release from Leavenworth, Karl began the criminal career that would span the next 18 years of his life. His pattern was consistent: steal everything he could carry, hurt anyone who got in his way, and disappear before the authorities could catch him. But Karl wasn't satisfied with simple theft. He had developed appetites that normal crime couldn't satisfy. Karl discovered that he enjoyed rape almost as much as robbery. He began systematically targeting men whom he had robbed, forcing them to submit to sexual assault before he left them beaten and humiliated. His physical strength, developed through years of hard labor in various prisons, made him nearly impossible for most men to resist. Between 1910 and 1920, Karl was arrested and imprisoned repeatedly across the American West and Southwest. He served time in California, Texas, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Connecticut, and New York. Each imprisonment was marked by violence against guards, escape attempts, and brutal retaliation from the prison authorities. But imprisonment also gave Karl time to think, and what he thought about was murder. He later wrote that during his various incarcerations, he spent countless hours planning not just individual murders, but mass killings. He fantasized about poisoning city water supplies, sinking ships, and starting wars between nations. These weren't idle daydreams. Karl was developing detailed plans for maximum destruction. In 1915, while serving time at Oregon State Penitentiary under the alias Jeff Baldwin, Karl got his first taste of murder. He helped a fellow inmate named Otto Hooker escape from prison. During Hooker's flight, he killed prison superintendent Harry Minto. Although Karl hadn't pulled the trigger, he had made the murder possible. The feeling of being connected to a killing excited him in ways that simple robbery never had. Karl escaped from Oregon State Penitentiary twice, the second time by soaring through the bars of his cell. Each escape taught him new skills and gave him more confidence. By 1918, when he successfully evaded capture after his second Oregon escape, Karl had become one of America's most wanted fugitives. Using the alias John O'Leary, Karl traveled across the country and even overseas. He worked on ships, sailed to Panama and Europe, and spent time in Peru working in copper mines. But wherever he went, Karl left a trail of theft, assault, and increasingly murder. The year 1920 marked Karl Panzram's transformation from a violent criminal into a serial killer. After a successful jewelry store robbery in Bridgeport, Connecticut, Carl found himself with $1,500 in cash, enough money to fund the darkest fantasies he had been planning for years. But before he could begin his real killing spree, Carl needed to settle an old score. He had never forgotten his brutal treatment at Fort Leavenworth, and he especially remembered the man whose signature had approved his sentence, William Howard Taft, who had been Secretary of War when Carl was court-martialed and was now a former U.S. president. On September 16, 1920, Carl burglarized Taft's mansion in New Haven, Connecticut. He stole a large amount of jewelry and bonds, but the prize he really wanted was Taft's personal Colt M19-111 .45 caliber handgun. Carl later wrote that stealing from Taft gave him more satisfaction than all his previous crimes combined. It wasn't just theft. It was personal revenge against a man who represented everything Carl hated about authority and society. Using Taft's stolen money, Carl purchased a small sailing yacht called the Akista. This boat would become his mobile killing machine for the next several years. Carl sailed the Akista to City Island in the Bronx, where he began hunting for victims among the sailors who frequented the waterfront bars. Carl's method was carefully planned and brutally efficient. He would approach lone sailors in bars, offering them work on his yacht or simply inviting them aboard for drinks. Once his victims were on the boat, Carl would get them drunk, rape them, shoot them with Taft's stolen pistol, and dump their bodies in Long Island Sound near Execution Rocks Light. The location wasn't chosen randomly. Execution Rocks Light had earned its name because of the dangerous rocks that had wrecked countless ships over the years. Carl knew that bodies dumped there would either be swept out to sea or smashed against the rocks beyond recognition. It was the perfect place to dispose of evidence. For 3 months from his base at City Island, Carl systematically murdered sailors. He later claimed to have killed 10 men during this period, though only some of these murders could be verified. What is certain is that several sailors disappeared after being seen with a man matching Carl's description, and their bodies were never found. Carl's yacht-based killing spree ended only by accident. During rough weather, the Akista ran aground and sank near Atlantic City, New Jersey. Carl's last 2 intended victims managed to escape during the chaos. If the boat hadn't sunk, Carl might have continued killing sailors indefinitely. After losing his floating murder headquarters, Carl was arrested in Stamford, Connecticut, for burglary and possession of a loaded handgun. He served 6 months in jail in Bridgeport, but imprisonment only made him more determined to escalate his violence. Upon his release in 1921, Carl traveled to Philadelphia, where he got into a shootout with police. Facing a long prison sentence, he managed to make bail and immediately fled to Norfolk, Virginia, where he caught a ship to Portuguese Angola in southern Africa. What Carl did in Angola represents some of the most disturbing crimes in the annals of serial murder. Working as a foreman on an oil rig, Carl had access to isolated areas and vulnerable local populations. When he grew bored with the work, he burned down the oil rig out of spitefulness. Carl then began a systematic campaign of rape and murder against the local population. He paid local families to provide him with young girls who he sexually assaulted before returning them and demanding his money back. When the families tried to satisfy him with even younger children, Carl escalated to murder. According to his own confession, Carl raped and killed an Angolan boy estimated to be 11 or 12 years old, but this single murder wasn't enough for him. Carl wrote that he hired 6 local men to take him crocodile hunting in a canoe. Once they were in the remote backwaters, Carl shot all 6 men with a Luger pistol and fed their bodies to the crocodiles. The casual nature of Carl's description of these murders is almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. He wrote about killing 6 innocent men as if he were describing a routine business transaction. The crocodiles, he noted with satisfaction, did the rest of disposing of the evidence. When local authorities began investigating the disappearances, Carl was forced to flee through the rainforest to the Belgian Congo. Even there, he continued committing crimes and assaults until he was finally forced to leave Africa entirely. Carl's return to the United States in 1922 marked the beginning of the most intensively documented period of his criminal career. He had learned from his experiences abroad that he preferred killing to simple robbery, But he also understood that he needed to be more careful to avoid capture. Back in New York, Carl had a silencer fitted to a pistol he had acquired in Africa. His plan was to become a professional assassin, but when he test-fired the silenced weapon, he found that it still made too much noise. "If that heavy-calibered pistol and the silencer had only worked as I thought it would," he later wrote, "I would have gone into the murder business on a wholesale scale." Disappointed by his failed assassination plans, Carl turned to what he knew best, targeting vulnerable victims who couldn't fight back. In July 1922, in Salem, Massachusetts, Carl abducted a young boy and beat him to death with a rock. Later that year, near New Haven, Connecticut, he strangled another child. Carl worked briefly as a night watchman in Yonkers, New York, but legitimate employment bored him. In 1923, he returned to his yacht-based hunting strategy, stealing boats and using them to find victims. In June 1923, he stole 2 yachts in quick succession. The first yacht belonged to Dr. Charles Payne of Larchmont, New York. Carl lost control of the vessel and crashed it onto rocks near New Rochelle. The second yacht belonged to the local police chief of New Rochelle, a choice that demonstrated Carl's growing contempt for law enforcement. Using the police chief's stolen yacht, Carl picked up a 15-year-old boy named George Wallasin, promising him a job on the boat. Instead, Carl sexually assaulted the boy repeatedly over several days. But George Wallasin became an unwilling witness to something even worse than his own assault. On June 27, 1923, while sailing near Kingston, New York, Carl encountered a man who he believed was planning to rob him. Carl's response was immediate and fatal. He shot the man with a .38 caliber pistol from the stolen yacht and threw the body into the river. George Wallasin watched this murder happen. The next day, when they docked at Poughkeepsie, Wallasin finally saw his chance. While Carl was distracted by stealing fishing nets, Wallasin jumped overboard and swam to shore. He immediately reported both his sexual assault and the murder he had witnessed to police in Yonkers. The police alert for Captain John O'Leary, one of Carl's many aliases, led to his arrest in Nyack on June 29, 1923. For the first time in his criminal career, Carl faced charges that included not just robbery and assault, but murder. A witness had survived, and the authorities finally had testimony that could put Carl away for life. Carl's response to his arrest revealed the cunning intelligence that had kept him free for so many years. He convinced his lawyer to accept ownership of a stolen boat in exchange for bail money, then immediately skipped bail. By the time government agents confiscated the boat, Carl was long gone. His freedom lasted only 2 months. On August 26, 1923, John O'Leary was arrested in Larchmont, New York, after breaking into a train depot. This time, there would be no escape and no bail. Carl was sentenced to 5 years in prison to be served first at Sing Sing Prison and later at Clinton Prison in Dannemora. Even in maximum security, Carl couldn't stop himself from attempting violence. He tried to escape from Clinton Prison and ended up with serious injuries, including a damaged spine and broken ankles. He also assaulted a guard, adding assault charges to his already lengthy sentence. But imprisonment also gave Carl something he had never had before: time to reflect on his crimes without the constant pressure of staying ahead of law enforcement. When he was discharged in July 1928, after serving nearly 5 years, Carl had come to a disturbing conclusion about his own nature. He wasn't going to stop killing. In fact, he was going to get better at it. Carl's last month of freedom, August 1928, was a concentrated burst of the violence that had defined his entire adult life. On August 20th, he burglarized a dentist's home in Washington, D.C., stealing a radio and jewelry. But simple theft no longer satisfied him. During that same month, Carl murdered at least 3 more victims. In Salem, he killed a young boy. In Connecticut, he murdered another child. And in Philadelphia, he killed 14-year-old Alexander Usaka, a newsboy who had the misfortune of encountering Carl near the Delaware River. Carl's method with young Alexander was particularly cruel. He forced the boy to help him steal items from a yacht, then killed him and wrapped his body in a blanket along with pieces of a broken radio. The mixture of murder and casual disposal of evidence showed how completely Carl had dehumanized his victims. When Karl was arrested on August 30th, 1928, he was no longer the cunning escapist who had evaded capture for so many years. He was tired of running, tired of hiding, and ready for whatever consequences his crimes would bring. For the first time in his criminal career, Karl gave the police his real name. During his interrogation, Karl confessed to multiple murders with a level of detail that shocked even experienced detectives. When asked why he killed children, Karl's response was chillingly honest. "I hate the human race and I get a kick out of murdering people." Given his extensive criminal record and his confessions to 21 murders, Karl Panzram was sentenced to 25 years to life at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. He was assigned inmate number 31614. Coincidentally, nearly the same institution where his transformation into a killer had begun 18 years earlier. Karl's warning to the warden was characteristically direct. "I'll kill the first man that bothers me." The prison authorities, recognizing that Karl was too dangerous for normal work assignments, placed him alone in the laundry room under the supervision of civilian foreman Robert Warnke. Warnke had a reputation for bullying and harassing prisoners. Despite repeated warnings from Karl, Warnke continued his aggressive behavior. On June 20, 1929, Karl made good on his promise. Using an iron bar, he beat Robert Warnke to death, crushing the man's skull completely. Karl's trial for Warnke's murder was swift. He was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. When offered the opportunity for appeals, Karl's response was typical. He refused all legal assistance and told anyone who tried to help him that he wished they all had one neck and that I had my hands on it. While on death row, Karl encountered the only person who had ever shown him genuine kindness. Prison guard Henry Lesser began giving Karl small amounts of money to buy cigarettes. This simple act of humanity so surprised Karl that when Lesser provided him with writing materials, Karl began documenting his entire criminal career. The result was a detailed autobiography that remains one of the most disturbing documents in criminal history. Karl began his written confession with words that revealed the complete absence of remorse that had driven his crimes. "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and, last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry." On September 5, 1930, Karl Panzram walked to the gallows at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Even in his final moments, he remained defiant. As guards attempted to place the traditional black hood over his head, Karl spat in the executioner's face. When asked for any last words, Karl's response was perfectly in character. "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." At 6:02 a.m., Karl Panzram was declared dead. He was 39 years old and had spent more than half his life in various prisons and reform schools. His death ended a criminal career that had spanned 3 decades and multiple continents. But Karl's death didn't end his story. The autobiography he had written in his final months, preserved by guard Henry Lesser, would eventually be published and studied by criminologists, psychologists, and true crime researchers. Nearly everything Karl wrote in his confessions could be verified or corroborated by official records, making his manuscript one of the most reliable first-person accounts of serial murder ever documented. Karl Panzram's legacy is one of almost incomprehensible violence and cruelty, but it's also a case study in how childhood abuse, institutional brutality, and systematic dehumanization can create monsters. His early experiences in reform schools and military prison didn't excuse his later crimes, but they help explain how a troubled child became one of America's most prolific serial killers. The victims Karl left behind, the sailors killed on his yacht, the children murdered across multiple states, the men he shot and fed to crocodiles in Africa, represent dozens of lives cut short by one man's inability to feel empathy or remorse. Their deaths serve as a reminder of the importance of identifying and treating violent behavior before it escalates to murder. Karl Panzram died as he had lived, angry, violent, and completely unrepentant. His final words to the world were a demand that his execution be hurried along so he wouldn't have to waste any more time with people he considered beneath his contempt. It was a fitting end to a life that had brought nothing but pain and death to everyone it touched. What do you think about Karl Panzram's case? Do you believe his childhood experiences explain his later crimes, or do you think some people are simply born evil? Was there any point at which Karl could have been saved, or was he beyond redemption by the time he committed his first murder? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case as disturbing and fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into America's most notorious criminals. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Remember to like this video if it kept you engaged, and share it with anyone who appreciates well-researched true crime content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.